afternoon or good morning, everybody. Today, I would like to present some of the basics about how your skin works, how it responds to the environment, both internal and external, and how that impacts not only the way you look, but the way you function. Could I have the next slide, please? So today we're going to cover how does the skin work? I mean, what is it there to really do, and how does it keep us? It's our largest organ. It's very, very important. It has a multiplicity of functions for us. And how does this happen, and how does it work, and what are the components in it? And then I'd like to talk about what happens as skin ages. What happens as you age chronologically? What forces are the skin subjected to that causes to perhaps age prematurely? And then finally, I'll wrap up with what we can do. What can we currently do to reverse skin aging and the accompanying deterioration in performance and appearance that happens? And so let's go to the first slide, please. Next slide. So how does the skin work, and what does the skin do? The primary function of the skin is to act as a barrier to dehydration. I don't know if you are all aware, but basically we are aquatic organisms internally. Most of our chemical reactions and most of our activity, neuroactivity, hormonal activity, happens in aquatic milieu. And because of that, because the biochemistry has to work in solution like that, our internal self is aquatic. Now, that was great while we were living in the ponds and the oceans and stuff like that. But the thing that allowed us to crawl out of the primordial muck and ooze is the fact that we were able to develop this barrier to protect us from the harsh external world. And this barrier, its primary function is to keep the water in and keep us hydrated. So all of those biochemical and other physiological functions continue to happen. But that's not the only thing the skin does. Skin has a tremendous sensory function, and it's not only neurosensory, feeling things, but it's immunologically sensory. It tells your body what's going on the outside and what you're in contact with. It provides a protective barrier from microorganisms, protective barrier from UV light and other things. So this very, very thin tissue, even though it's the largest organ you have, this very, very thin tissue is doing lots of things. It's an excretory organ. It puts out sweat and salts, and it's a neurosensory organ to protect you from when something in the environment is triggering an alarm response. So how does that happen? Your skin is not just a bunch of cells. It's not saran wrap. It's not a wrapping. It's a living, breathing, active organ that senses what's going on in its environment, and it has surface receptors that help protect and provide information about disturbances in the environment, not only to the skin itself, but to the rest of your body. I might add that there is also, it's living in partnership with something called the microbiome, and that's a whole series of other living creatures, bacteria and whatnot, on your skin surface that live in harmony and symbiosis with your skin. So your skin is not simply a saran wrap barrier, it's a very active and engaging functional organ. And that has to be kept in mind as you start to design products that impact the appearance and the way that skin works. So let's take a look at what the skin looks like inside. Next slide, please. Here's some electron micrographs showing you what the skin looks like inside. And the first one on the left is a close-up of the skin surface. Now, this is only magnified about 75 times, but you can see the detail in the pillow-like structure there. This is from the back of the hand, actually the back of my hand. And you can see the small bumps on each pillow. Each one of those is a stratum corneocyte, or a skin cell that's keeping the surface keeping the barrier in function and it interfacing with the surface. In the middle slide, you see a cross-section of the skin. This is a light micrograph, and it's magnified about 75, 80 times. And here you can see at the bottom where it says D on the slide, that's the dermis, that's the dermal part of the skin. And then those other parts above it are the epidermis, very thin. It's only about 5 to 7 cell layers thick in some places. And then at the very top is the flattened cells called the stratum corneum. The entire barrier we were talking about, the entire moisture barrier, is resident in those 3 or 4 cells on the surface. So that's how close you are, and that's how important this organ is in keeping you functional, your whole body functional. Now, one thing that's important to note is that the skin turns over very rapidly. It turns over monthly. And what happens is the cells at the bottom, those ones just above the D, are the basal cells, and they start to reproduce there. And as they reproduce, they push upwards. And there's a whole maturation scheme that happens in the skin, where as the cells push up and mature, they become those stratum corneum, ultimately become those stratum corneocytes that you see at the very top. Now, you can see the transitional state in that area marked SG. That's called the stratum granulosum, but that's where the cells are actually going the transition from a living epithelial cell into those flattened barrier cells called stratum corneocytes. So that's how the skin essentially works at the tissue level. Now, if we go inside one of those cells, if we go inside in one of those cells in the basal layer above the dermis, and that's the electron micrograph on your right, that's magnified about 35,000 times. You can see that inside the cell, there's a lot of stuff going on. You can see keratin bundles there. You can see mitochondria that are providing energy to the skin. You can see something called the endoplasmic reticulum, that is where all the proteins and keratin is made. And you can see the nucleus there, where all the DNA information is. So what seems to be a very simple and straightforward organ, when you get into it, it becomes highly complex, highly interactive, and very, very structurally interesting in terms of how it functions with the rest of your body. Next slide, please. Now, that's not all. In the last slide, we were talking simply about this upper layer here in the diagram called the epidermis. If you see that big pink space below it, that's called the dermis. And in the dermis, there's a lot of activity going on. Not only does the hair follicle originate in the dermis, but in the dermis, that serves as the support system for your skin, where you have different types of cells working to produce materials like collagen, elastase, and other materials that build the structure inside the skin. And these become important later because they can become damaged by environmental impact, and that's what ultimately leads to part of the skin aging. If we go back up to the epidermis, there are some cells in there that also, it's not just the back, please. It's not just the cells, epithelial cells or the epidermal cells. There are also melanocytes, which make pigmentation, which also can have an impact on aging. There are things called Langerhans cells, which are the cells that are the immunosensory cells. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in the epidermis. If we look on to the right, we can see the other functions of the skin, the apocrine and the eccrine functions, and those are the excretory functions, have to do with the excretory functions of the skin, where it's removing sweat and toxins from your body. Next slide. So now you know all about skin structure, and now let's talk about skin aging. How does the skin age? What makes the skin age? Well, time makes the skin age, and by time, we're thinking about your whole lifespan, from when you're a very young child to all the way up to where you're living to a point where no one ever dreamed we would live that long. the one function of the skin that stays intact for a long time throughout your entire lifespan is its barrier function, because it's so critical. But a lot of the other functions that are dependent on other activities in the skin and in the cells, slow down. And so as time goes on, cell function and reparative function diminishes. It's slower to repair environmental damage, and as such, environmental damage begins to accumulate, and it impacts the surface structure. Environmental damage impacts the color of the skin, because the melanocytes who were maybe making uniform colors are now sort of disconnected, and some are more color, producing more melanin than others, and as such, you get a blotchy appearance, and that's why a lot of people are very, very in tune with getting their skin color back even again. It's not necessarily the color of the skin that matters. It's the fact that it looks even and uniform. And then finally, in the dermis, we have all those structural proteins, the collagen and elastin, that give your skin its firmness and strength, and it allows the skin to maintain its surface texture, which is, when you're young, very, very smooth, and as you get older, starts to reflect the lines of the underlying musculature. So that's what happens as you get older. Everything slows down, everything is not as quick to repair, but what stays constant? And what stays constant are the environmental insults, those factors that cause exogenous factors that cause the skin to age. And those insults remain constant. And what are some of those insults? Some of those insults are harsh weather, chemicals, UVB, UVA, infrared light. Next slide, please. So what happens is, for your skin to stay young, the repair rate has to remain greater than the rate of damage. So it's not that your skin is getting older by itself, it's the skin is getting older in a harsh environment. And this is what leads to skin aging. And that's what we're going to talk about now a little more. Next slide. So what happens as your skin ages? Well, lines and wrinkles appear, again, because as the firmness in the dermis starts to break away and deteriorate, because the cells of the dermis aren't producing as much collagen and elastin and protein mass and other materials, the skin starts to sag and take on some of the look of the underlying musculature in either your face, in the very thin-skinned areas, or in other areas where it just may sag a bit. Uneven skin tone develops, and that, as we just mentioned, has to do with the dysfunction in the melanocytes. You know, those sun-exposed areas of your skin, you want them, like your face and your arms and legs and hands, you want them to be the same color, but they don't, because not all the melanocytes are in sync. Again, as we mentioned, you get increased laxity, loss of resilience, the skin starts to sag a bit, and you get chronic dryness, and that sometimes happens because of irritation, and the skin starts turning over too fast and gets flaky and is not forming a proper barrier, so it's constantly trying to catch up, and as it constantly tries to catch up, and the maturation processes are not up to the par they were, then you start to have the flakiness and dryness that can be chronic. You have reduced immune protection, that is, the skin acting as an immune sensory organ. Doesn't necessarily sense all the things that are floating around in the environment that can happen. And as such, there are really two reasons why, as you age, cancer risk rises, skin cancer risk rises. One has to do with the consistent environmental exposure, particularly from UVB light and other things, but it's also the reduced immune protection and there's just natural problems that occur, because if the DNA repair rates in that nucleus, remember that nucleus we looked at, if the DNA repair rates drop, if some damage occurs to the genetic material inside the skin, it can be replicated, and then things can get out of whack that way. And so it's really a matter of, because your skin's DNA doesn't repair itself as efficiently as it did when you were younger, your risk of having a dysfunction or a mutation arises, and that's what can lead to a tumor as well. So next slide, please. So what are we going to do about it? And what are the things we can do to maintain the longevity of the skin, particularly in products? What kind of functionality can we build into our products that makes them actually somewhat reparative and work against that natural reduction in repair rates? What can we do? Well, the first and most important thing is protection, protection, protection. You want to make sure the barrier is optimized and it's repairing itself well. And you can put certain types of lipids in your products. You can put ceramides, cholesterol, fatty acids, other types of materials, hyaluronic acid, glycosaminoglycans, and things that help seal the barrier and help signal the skin that the barrier is in good shape so it doesn't keep trying to reproduce itself. You can provide as much UVB, UVA, and IR protection. Yes, heat can cause deterioration of the skin. So you can provide as much of that as you possibly can, or you just stay inside the house in a nice, cool, dark place. But people do like to go out, so I think you really have to opt for the UVB and UVA protection. And then finally, you need to use those agents that not only are antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, the things that reduce the micro wounding of the skin. What happens as you age, you have a constant state of inflammation in the skin. And with that inflammation, there's collective damage. So if you subdue that inflammation as best as you can by collecting free radicals and by using anti-inflammatories to reduce that constant wound healing state, that constant state of turbulence in the skin, you can help keep it protected and calm for a longer period of time. And genetic hygiene means using those agents that will help your DNA repair processes optimize themselves. Again, they tend to slow down as you age. And so what you want to do is make sure that you have some kind of agents that help boost that activity in your skin. You can stimulate repair in the skin. So you have protection on the one hand, and then you have stimulation of repair on the other side. So on the other side, you can use things like retinoids, peptides, to stimulate biochemical activity, stimulate the fibroblasts to make more collagen and elastin, stimulate processes in the basal layer of the skin so that it resynchronizes itself better. So there's a lot of things you can do there. Physically with exfoliation, or chemically with AHAs and BHAs, or can't use plastic, and walnut beads. You can smooth the surface and again stimulate the skin with its own repair by slightly stimulating the skin surface, gently stimulating the skin surface. And one of the less, I like it less, but one of the ways you could influence repair of the skin is by causing some micro wounds inside the skin with some abrasion, microabrasion, radio high frequency irradiation, or IR irradiation. So those are ways to tell the skin it has to repair. Again, those are things, the IR and RF go deeper in the skin, and they tell the dermis that there's been a wound and you have to do wound repair action. That's not my primary choice of mode of action, but that's another set of methods that have been used. So next slide. in the brief time we've had together, I've tried to cover a lot of different stuff, and I know I've left a lot of questions and a lot of open-ended rabbit holes for us to go down. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to write me at Independent Beauty Association. And if you have any questions now, I'll be happy to take them as long as time permits. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ken, for such very informative and educational presentation. We have a few minutes for questions. Let's see if there's any questions. I actually have a questions for Ken. Can you tell us about what's the best way to optimize skin wellness?
The things that make the skin well are the things that restore equilibrium and homeostasis in the skin and make it think that it's in a healthy, quiet state, so it can optimize what it's doing. So that means making sure that you've included soothing agents in your product, you've included barrier repair agents in your product. Again, so the skin can naturally, you're supporting the skin's existing functions, and that creates the sense of skin, the skin wellness that leads to a beautiful skin. If you have an unwell skin, and that means a broken barrier, dysfunctional cells, and all these other things, that's where the beauty part starts to slip. Now, the one thing I didn't talk about, but I know the other two speakers are going to cover it, is the internal destimulation of the skin, or the internal things that happen because of internal stress, anxiety, and some of the other stuff. So just to give you a heads up, I know both our other speakers are going to go into that area to talk about the internal stimulation and internal physiology that can be bad for the skin.
Great, interesting. I just thought Cherie has a question. What would be the best ingredient to look for in a high performance product in the drugstore or Target? And should we look at ingredients or the benefits of the whole formula?
Well, you should look for targeted ingredients, a couple of targeted ingredients. Retinol, you really want a retinoid in there if they have it, or vitamin C. And you're right, it's the complexity and the complex of the whole composition that means something. So you could dump some retinol on your skin and it wouldn't necessarily mean anything. It has to be in the appropriate vehicle or appropriate composition, so it'll penetrate in the skin and get the job done, along with the other materials that you might put in there. Again, there are lots of soothing agents that are botanically derived. There are many soothing agents that can either be botanically derived or synthetic. And so what you really look, the thing that makes cosmetics and skincare so interesting is that most products are a very complex mix of multifunctional ingredients. And it's just the art is getting those ingredients in a form that people firstly want to use and slather all over themselves, that it gets the ingredients to the skin, but at the same time keeps those ingredients in stabilized and in shape so that when they get to the skin, they can do their job.
Well, thank you very much.